Hey, it's Eddie and welcome to another edition of Stuff and Things. Today I'm back at the dome-shaped underground house and I'm going to be doing a tutorial on the styrofoam lining and how you do it. I apologize, I didn't do a time lapse on this. I probably should have. I got sidetracked, I kind of spaced out, got into it, and we just banged it out in about, I think it was a week and a half to 2 weeks took us. Myself and at least one or sometimes 2 or 3 other guys. So, the styrofoam, here's a couple of things to keep in mind. You're going to have 2 layers of styrofoam on the structure, an outer layer and an inner layer. An important factor in this is to make sure that the seams are staggered, not just on the horizontal plane, but also on the vertical. So the horizontal, vertical. You want the seam staggered simply because the seam is a weak point. It's where the concrete will be pressing and could potentially fail and break. If you have 2 of them lined up, now you've got a real weak point, so by staggering them, you make it a lot stronger. We have 2 sections of the house. We have the barrel section, which has a curvature in one direction, and we have a dome section, which has a curvature in the other direction. The barrel section is fairly easy because you're not fighting a curve that keeps getting tighter and tighter and tighter as you work your way up. So with the barrel sections, you can pretty much take full sheets, cut them to the distance between these 2 I-beams, and lay them in. What I did was, if you notice down here, I used a 1 or 2 foot strip and then a full sheet and then a full sheet and a full sheet, and on the back side I did the same thing. So that way I have all my seams staggered on the back. So the seam here that you see here, the split in the back would probably be somewhere in here. When you place these up, basically we just use strips of wood and wire. Okay, this is just rebar tie wire. 1 guy's on the inside, 1 guy's on the outside. The guy on the inside cuts a length of wire, usually about 18 inches long, stuffs it through the styrofoam on both ends, wraps it around a piece of wood, and the guy on the backside grabs it, pulls it tight, and ties it to the rebar. He will also place spacer blocks, not at every tie, but spacer blocks are placed throughout the structure. We use 1-inch spacer blocks. You can buy them in bulk from most rebar suppliers, and we tie them in wherever, because you don't want the styrofoam pressed up against the rebar. You want the spacer, you want about a 1-inch space between the styrofoam and the rebar. A couple things, when you're cutting the wire, cut the wire at a sharp angle. Even though it's thin wire, sometimes this stuff is hard to punch through, and by having it at a sharp angle, it'll punch through. I use these little wood strips. These are actually shims, because I happen to pick up, like, I don't know, a ton of them at an auction for like $5. So, but we also used in certain spots when we ran out of these little wood strips, these little shims, we use strips of plywood. So any sort of wood works, as long as it's thin enough that it can be flexible, but thick enough that it has some strength and rigidity. A couple things on the ties. Whenever there was a seam, we tended to do extra ties because the seams are a weak point. You want to, at the edges, you want to get this cut and fit in here as snug as possible because you don't want to have any gaps here either. So barrel section is fairly simple. It's not as much cutting and carving and filling. The dome section, however, is another story. Let me show you that. So what we're doing here is we pre-cut this side with the backing, skin on it so that the concrete doesn't stick to it. This goes to the outside. Then we'll place that here. Brandon will hold it up top. Take a chair. Take the next piece. Slide that in here. Then I will take a wood slat. I'll edit that out. I dropped that thing on my freaking head. Piece of wire. Okay, Bannon, come on down. Go ahead, tie that up to hold this in place. Good? Yeah. Now cut the next piece. don't line up. Top's hit, there's a big gap. So what I'm going to do is mark the distance between there and then trim that off of this so this one will butt up to it. I'll show you how I do that. So the gap at the bottom is 4 3/4 inches. So what we're going to do is take 4 3/4 inches off the top so that the two will butt up together. So the little pieces that we snap off, we save those because we may need them as filler pieces later. See how nicely that fits? There's a little bit of a gap. What we'll do is we'll cover that on the outside with some duct tape so the concrete doesn't pull through, and even if it did, it's such a thin amount of concrete it'd be easy to chisel off. But anywhere where there's gaps, we try to either fill them with styrofoam or cover them with tape. Another thing I like to do is that sometimes when you have a clean side, I try to leave the clean side uncut because it gives you a nice straight edge to put to, because when you cut them, it never gets perfectly straight. Okay, as you can see behind me, the dome section gets tighter and tighter as we get to the top. And what that means is that when you're cutting your sheets, you're going to have to cut them into smaller and smaller pieces. At the bottom of the dome, we were able to use 4 by 8 sheets of styrofoam. As we get higher, it becomes much easier to start cutting the sheets into smaller sections. As we started the second floor, we kind of stuck with 4 by 8 sheets cut in half and used those to build our pieces. And as we got near the top of the dome, it made more sense to cut and use smaller pieces. Plus, we used a lot of our scrap and our cutoff near the top of the dome, which saved us some material. Formworks gives you plenty of styrofoam. In fact, I've always ended up having a few sheets extra when I'm done, and that's partially because I try to utilize a lot of the scrap and not have as much waste. So again, the tying is the same rules apply. You don't want to have seams lined up. You want to make sure that you stagger your seams. Okay, as you can see on the styrofoam here, basically the spacing on the ties is supposed to be about 18 inches. I erred a little bit closer together because I didn't want to have any bows or anything that happens, that gets funky. So in some areas we tied more. Basically what you do is you tie it up and then you walk around and you kind of push on it. And anywhere where it seems to have a lot of give, you either tighten up the ties around it or you throw more ties in. If the dome does bow a little bit when they apply the shotcrete, it's not a big deal. In fact, in my last house I had a big bow on the second floor, which I thought was going to end up looking really awful because part of it just kind of came in probably 6 to 8 inches. They stopped putting concrete on, let that harden, and then they were able to put another layer on, but I now had a bow up inside the master bedroom. Well, it turns out that once we had plastered over that and painted it, you couldn't even see it. So it's not going to be perfect. Don't expect that you're going to get a perfect smooth inside finish, because the likelihood is you're not. And even if you do get little bows and stuff, the likelihood is once you're done painting and doing, what you're going to do on the inside finish, the plaster, etc., you probably won't see it anyways. Now you'll notice the black spots there and over in there. That's basically where the rebar gets awful close to where the second floor is. And we couldn't fit styrofoam behind it. So what we did is we wrapped that with black tar paper, and the concrete will basically go up against that and should be fine. And even if a little bit bows in, it won't matter because you won't see it because it's in between the floors. So if you have any questions, post them in the comments section below and I'll try to answer them. I hope that helps.